Hi, everyone. This is Nicole Chamberlain, and welcome to this next panel coming up. We have a really wonderful panel of filmmakers that they're near and dear to my heart. I'm as well a documentary filmmaker, so I'm excited to introduce first and foremost, our moderator, our person who's organizing it a little bit is Daniel Bergin. And he's our moderator who is a leading history filmmaker at our local PBS station, TPT. And he was once called Minnesota's hippest history teacher by the Star Tribune. He's 15-time regional Emmy Award-winning producer-director, and he has been recognized as a Minnesota State Arts Board, a City Pages Artist of the Year, and a Bush Leadership Fellow for his work in the community. I'd like to introduce to you Daniel Bergin. Take it away.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us. Really been looking forward to this time and this discussion. I'm coming to you from South Minneapolis, just blocks from George Floyd Square. Also near George Floyd Square, blocks from where Gordon Parks once lived here in Minneapolis. And I mentioned that just because the idea of Gordon Parks and his choice of weapons as a pioneering photojournalist and filmmaker is, I think, in the same vein as this idea of peace building. And so I think my new friends, Hunter and Joe, will agree, and I think their work amazingly exemplifies that ethos of journalism, media making that Minnesota's Gordon Parks really exemplified. So I'm excited to talk with those two. I'm excited to bring you all into the conversation as well. We're going to start with a few questions, and then we'll eventually draw the rest of you in. And of course, you can start by putting some of your thoughts or questions into the chat. But Hunter and Joe, thanks. It's good to see you two again. Great to see pieces of your work before the session started again. It's really amazing and powerful work. And it really, it does make me think of that proverb I read somewhere. If you know someone, you can't harm them. If you know someone's story, you can't harm them. If you know somebody's story, you can't harm them. The work you two do, I think, is really kind of working at that idea. So I thought, by way of introduction, if you could introduce yourself, maybe talk a little bit about one of the films that really speaks to who you are and what you do. And then we'll get into the conversation from there. Hunter, do you want to go ahead and go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, Daniel. And thank you to everybody, to the Humphrey School and to this Navy family for hosting this really important symposium. I've been tuning in all day, and it's been super eye-opening. I love all the diverse perspectives we've been hearing. And finally, I'm super honored to be in conversation with both Daniel and Joe, who are extremely talented, established, wonderful storytellers. And yeah, just honored to be amongst them. Just a quick introduction. My name's Hunter Johnson. I'm also calling in from Minneapolis, and I'm a documentary filmmaker and photographer, and have been doing that for about last 10 years. And recently decided to focus my work in issues of human rights. And I can speak a little bit more to that later, but I ended up going back to school, and I'm a graduate of the Humphrey School, and I got a master's in human rights, with my focus being arts advocacy. So finding ways to apply documentary filmmaking and visual storytelling to issues of human rights. And the project that I'll be talking about a lot today is, you may have just seen some clips. It's called Until We Find Them. And it follows two independent journalists who report on disappearances in Guadalajara. And that short documentary was born out of kind of the human rights research done at the University of Minnesota. And I was involved in that and kind of pivoted to tell a story through documentary. So that's kind of my latest work, and I'm currently getting out in the world. So thanks.
Well, I'm Joe Piscatella. Again, honored to be here. Thank you to the Humphrey School. I'm honored to be on this panel with these two esteemed colleagues, because both of them have done just incredible work. I started my career writing family comedy for Disney and DreamWorks. I did a lot of family films, some animated movies. I did a lot of comedy punch-ups on some of the big animated movies of the early and mid 2000s. And I had the opportunity to go make a single documentary film. It was supposed to be a one-off. I thought it was going to be, I'm going to take a year off, do this one film. It was called #Chicago Girl, about a 19-year-old girl in Chicago, an American teenager who was helping run the Syrian revolution. And I got to the end of that film and I was bit by the documentary bug. I mean, and part of it was you only get to make so many films in your career. And I realized I wanted films that could shine a light in some dark places. I wanted films that could bring issues that are important, but maybe that we don't pay close enough attention to. And from that film, I made a film called Joshua Teenager versus Superpower about Joshua Wong, who's the most visible face of all the turmoil you're seeing in Hong Kong now. He lit the fuse on that when he was 13 years old. And the Joshua film did very well. It won Sundance a few years ago, was acquired as a Netflix original. And that led to my next film called My Koi and the Dissidents, which is out in Europe right now. I think it'll be out here in the US shortly. I don't have a date on that, but it's about a Vietnamese pop star who in Vietnam, we all forget it's a very communist country. We all think of it as a lovely place to go backpacking and to be a tourist and go to the beach. But it is a heavily censored country. And this pop star, in Vietnam, it's state-controlled media. If they deem that you were the next pop star, guess what? You get to be the next pop star. And she had everything she ever wanted: fame, fortune, riches. And she started to feel very uncomfortable with the human rights situation in Vietnam. She was seeing a lot of her friends being silenced or jailed or worse. And she decided to speak up. And so the common thread through all of my films is unlikely heroes that stand up to enormous power structures. Usually knowing what the consequences are going to be and still choosing to go forward anyhow.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you both. I want to get back to that idea of character-driven narratives, but I wanted to start with this forum in mind and these folks gathered here with this idea of peace building. I mean, I see it in both of your work, but it's a really lofty aspiration, but really one to aspire towards. And I think it is. So I'm interested in restorative narratives. I think that's similar kind of vein of doing the work we do with real intention in mind. But I wanted to ask you too, and Joe, maybe you could go first. What does that phrase, that idea of peace building mean to you in the work you do?
Well, it's why when I was approached to be on this panel, that was the first question that they asked me, and the light bulb immediately went off above my head because, I make these films that are in places that are outside the United States. They're places that most Americans know there's probably some sort of a problem going on, but they aren't paying really close attention to it. Some of them are very complicated situations where it's hard to pay attention to because there is no right or wrong answer that's immediately available. And my goal as a filmmaker is always, let's find a character that you can latch onto, a character that you can identify with. And now let's tell that story and get you to care about something you didn't care about before. When we were making my first film, #Chicago Girl, when we would tell people we were making a film about Syria, we actually called it the Syria eye glaze. You could see people's eyes just glaze over, even when you were pitching it. And people had Middle East fatigue at the time. We had been in the Middle East. Our military had been there for going on, 15 plus years. It seemed like a lot of stories coming out of the Middle East were not positive ones. We had fatigue, and we realized we couldn't get people to care about the situation in Syria, but I could get them to care about a 19-year-old American teenager in Chicago who was making an enormous difference in a place thousands of miles away. And suddenly people got excited about that topic. And I realized, to me, that's peace building. It's getting people to recognize themselves in people that maybe aren't from the same place, that look different, that speak a different language, and through that, getting them to see what the issue is and why they need to pay attention to it.
Hunter, how do you see peace building in the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, really similar to Joe in regards to identifying characters that you can use and that can be the vessel in which you explain an issue and get people to care. When I think about my role too as a storyteller, I often think of myself as an advocate trying to uplift the people that are on the ground doing the work, and so like in this instance of Until We Find Them, the two journalists that are engaged in this work, they are doing peace building. Like they are, seeking to tell the real stories of these families, thousands of families who are searching for their missing loved ones in Mexico on a case-by-case basis, when, that's a dangerous job to do. And it's a difficult job to do for a lot of reasons, but they're putting themselves, they're diving, headfirst into that issue. And, me as a storyteller, I always just want to uplift those people and give them as big of a platform as I can. But keeping the narrative as true to them as possible. So it's really about building a story with them, but at the same time, telling it in a way that will resonate with other audiences. But for me, I see myself as kind of uplifting the peace builders.
That's lovely. I want to ask you more about uplifting some of your other intentional strategies, but I wanted to just build on that a little bit. In part because I know we've got some journalists in the room, we've got other policy folks, artists, activists as well. But I wanted to ask you two about that idea of these different kind of the nomenclature of storytelling and what that can do or how it can impede or empower some of the things that we all try to do with narratives. So how do you describe yourself? Where are you on that spectrum of activist, artist, journalist? And what are those different kind of stages of that spectrum do to the kind of work we believe in? Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, I look at myself as I'm a storyteller. I mean, I documentary film is just another medium to tell a story in the same way that an animated movie is a medium to tell a story. And, part of my process is if I take on a story for documentary, I actually beat out the story. I note card it like before I shoot a single frame. Now, those note cards are going to change 1,000 times. Real life does not unfold like a narrative, but I want to at least know what I'm shooting for. And so I've been called an activist before, and that's a label I'm uncomfortable with. I believe in what these people are doing. I believe in my subjects, but I still see myself as, hey, my activism is really through storytelling. And my activism is through getting people to pay attention to something they didn't want to pay attention to, or that they didn't even know that they weren't aware of what was going on. I mean, what I'm always so fascinated by when I make these films, like I made this film, Joshua, Teenager versus Superpower. And there's a lot of very educated people that are in my audience. And to have people who I know read the newspapers every day, read multiple newspapers every day, come up to me and say, I did not know that's what the situation was, or I did not know the situation was so bad. I knew there was something bad going on, but it was kind of white noise in the background because there's a lot of bad things going on in the world. And so again, I look at my role is, a little bit like Hunter's role. Yeah, I want to elevate the peacemakers. I want to get people front and center so that they can be heard, so that they can shine a light in these dark places, and so that we can continue the conversation. Because, in something like Syria is a very complex topic. There is no, here's what we have to do, or here's what we need to do. The way I describe it to people is, I look at all that we have done and I know this isn't it. This is not what we're supposed to be doing. And yet I don't know what the solution is. But the solution isn't going to come from ignoring the situation. The solution is going to come from continuing to talk about it, continuing to keep it in the conversation, continuing to focus on it and not look away, because it is a hard topic. It's the same thing with Hong Kong's relationship to China, or freedom of speech in Vietnam, or the myriad of issues we have here in our own country. How do you keep those conversations going? And I look at what my role is, and yeah, I'm a little uncomfortable with being called an activist. I'm even uncomfortable being called a filmmaker. Yes, I make films, but at the end of the day, I'm a storyteller. And I think story is a powerful way to get people to pay attention to something they need to pay attention to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hunter, how do you respond to that, even that tension of quote unquote bias or point of view? Because your films are really about characters as well. And so from that comes a point of view. Have you ever gotten any pushback, or how do you even internally kind of process that as you're making it in terms of other ideas or perspectives?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, my experience today going into a story, I worked with I worked with an NGO for many years doing video work, and then I worked with a small documentary team and producing a web series. And so we told a lot of stories pretty quickly. And what I realized is, like, going into a story, you always have something that's bringing you there that's of interest, right? That's the reason you're going to it. But oftentimes what I found is, like, that's not necessarily the story that your subject wants to share. When you actually start filming, you realize it's actually a different narrative that is their story. And to me, it's always being adaptable and always, like, willing to change whatever preconceived notion I had of what the story was to be the most genuine. And in the example of Until We Find Them, these are journalists that, it's a dangerous job. So it's also a conversation where it's like, hey, I want to create something that supports you, that highlights the issue, but also is something that you're safe with and you want. And so it's really about making a film with them. And of course, like, there is pushback if there's things that shouldn't be included, or maybe, as a foreigner, I don't completely understand the context. And so it's just about, being open to making those changes and telling the most accurate story you can.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I just kind of asked those questions just in that vein of, and in our time, and thinking, Joe, about what's happening to journalism in Hong Kong, this week. Just that idea of journalistic ethics and accountability, but also what we see in you two, in your work, point of view, lived experience, and perspective. And that's, again, where this idea of restorative narratives comes in, of, kind of universal truths, but hard truths. Strength-based storytelling is important, and I love that. I see that in both of your work. But Hunter, you bring up something that I wanted to talk to. I'm sure everyone is interested in with both of your work, and that is your subjects and their safety. How are you how do you process that? You mentioned a little bit about in the moment of making, but even now, after. And again, my hero Gordon Parks kind of wrote a lot about how, when his photo essays in Life magazine kind of brought the world's attention to poverty in Brazil, or to poverty in America and Harlem, that sometimes the results were, not what he expected or even hoped for. The family struggled with the notoriety. But of course, in you two, in your work, there's much more kind of serious potential danger. Can you both talk a little bit about that, and kind of how you work through that with your subjects, and then and how you kind of carry that along as the films are there on Netflix and out in the world, and your subjects are still kind of in their world? Joe, do you want to start with
Sure,
that?
I'll kick this one off. It's the most difficult part of my job. Is I have these subjects. Most of them are teenagers. Some of them are, like I said, Joshua Wong was 13 when my team first started following him. And I see my subjects making decisions that, as an adult, I know that there's going to be dire consequences for them. Now, in the back of their mind, they know there's consequences. And at the same time, there's a youthful naivete. There's a youthful belief that they really can change something that maybe the rest of the world doesn't feel could truly be changed, or changed enough. And that's a struggle for me, because part of me wants to sit them down and say, hey, I know how this is going to end for you, or a potential ending. And they don't. And at the same time, as a filmmaker, what they're doing is very exciting. And it's not my job to steer them. But it really hit home for me. So in my first film, #ChicagoGirl, we wanted to find a team on the ground in Syria to partner with, because we were capturing the story of this 19-year-old girl in Chicago running the revolution through social media and some other aspects. And we ended up connected with a filmmaker named Basil Shahadeh. Basil was a Fulbright scholar at Syracuse. He was a filmmaker, and a true filmmaker, not just a kid with a camera. And when the revolution started, he went back to his home in Syria and said, I'm not going to pick up an AK-47, but I'm going to use my camera. That's my weapon. And Basil and I partnered together, and he, every day we would Skype, and we would outline, these are the shots I want to get today. And he'd say, great, I can get you 1 through 30. 30 through 40 are going to be a little hard, and there's no way I'm doing 40 to 50. You're going to get me killed. And he was my partner in the sense he helped cast the film. He shot a good part of the film. He smuggled our footage out. He was really a revolutionary guy. And we were at the end of filming, and he decided that he was going to go into Homs, which was the big war zone at the time in Syria. And he was going to get he was going to teach citizen journalists how to document human rights atrocities so that if and when the Assad regime does fall, there will be a record of it and people can be held accountable. And within 3 weeks, he was shot and killed. I get choked up when I talk about it because that's not supposed to happen. He's a 27-year-old filmmaker. He did not pick up an AK-47. He was holding a camera. And so for me, it's a struggle. I'm not quite old enough to be their parents, but I'm certainly not their peers. And it's a hard bridge to gap, knowing the consequences. And at the same time, as a filmmaker, the stakes are high and the stakes are heavy. And that's attractive as a filmmaker of, hey, these kids are really putting it on the line. I'm not. I'm in Santa Monica right now. I get, yes, sometimes I go to these conflict zones, but I get to come home. They don't. This is where they live, and this is where they operate, and this is where they're going to take their stand. And so it's a long-winded answer to your question of, it's something I struggle with. It's probably the hardest part of what I do.
Not long-winded, it's a story. Thank you for sharing it too. It's powerful. Hunter, Dr. Squires mentioned Gordon Parks. She works with youth at Gordon Parks High School here in the Twin Cities in St. Paul. And that idea of choice of weapons and seeing the reporters in your film, and they're so in that vein of that idea. But what's that process like for you? What kind of conversations do you have with those subjects? They just seem courageous, almost fearless, but it's terrifying for just watching it, knowing the milieu they're in.
Yeah, totally. And it's kind of meta in the sense that I'm a storyteller telling stories about storytellers, and they are extremely public with their work, and that's how I found them from here in Minnesota. And it is a constant conversation. It's a constant concern, like Joe said. But at the end of the day, they're out there with their stories anyways, and they're very public in Mexico. And at the end of the day, I'm hoping that this film makes more people care about them and offers them some extra, a stronger shield, really. Just because there's more people keeping tabs, when I show it to people in the US, who, for many, it's an introduction to the issue of disappearances. One of the reasons why we made this film was because we found there was a huge gap in knowledge between, people in Mexico and outside of Mexico, what exactly is this crisis? A lot of people have heard of some of the outlier cases that have made international news, like the 43 students that were disappeared in 2014. But largely, people don't really understand that it's a daily occurrence and kind of the government's role in perpetuating it, either directly carrying it out or not investigating. And so people that are being introduced to this topic in the US, they're really interested. They want to know how they can help, but they also are concerned directly for the protagonists of the film. They're asking about Darwin and Dahlia. They're asking about Nancy, one of the mothers of a boy that was disappeared, who's featured in the film. And that to me is just hey, they're calling these subjects of the film by their first names, asking, are they okay? I'm worried about them. And to me, that's successful. When I talk to them directly, Darwin and Dahlia, about this film, about, do they feel like it puts them at any increased risk? They tell me no. And they honestly tell me no. And they say that they think if anything, it's careful. And I didn't understand that at first, but now I understand it because I've seen quite a few more documentaries coming out of Mexico around the issue that really point the finger at specific government officials, specific people, because they're trying to generate pressure to get somebody out of a position or whatever. And those I think tend to be even some of the more dangerous stories to tell, whereas mine is kind of a more general introduction to the topic and about these empathetic journalists.
Peace building, yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think about this, y'all, in my work as well, and so I appreciate this time that we've spent on this idea of the kind of accountability, the idea of journalistic ethics, but ethics more broadly. One piece I did was exploring, and this was a few years ago when there was still a lot of stigma around mental illness. And it was a series we did with a local health organization, Health Partners, to try and reduce the stigma. And their campaign continues to this day to literally get people to take a pledge to kind of do their part to reduce the stigma around mental illness. And so, some journalists might wonder about this, but it was important for me to show rough cuts to some of the subjects who were sharing their stories. And, again, that might strike some as a practice that you wouldn't do in mainstream journalism, but it felt totally appropriate and really necessary in this process. Also led to, better storytelling in terms of information or an errant soundbite where someone said, did I really say that? I shouldn't have. That's actually really inappropriate to describe, methods of attempted suicide. So, the story was better and I think safer because of opening up the process a little bit. Have you two done some of that in your work with the films?
So my relationship with my subjects, I don't make my films normally for the country where this is taking place. I'm making it for the rest of the world. And so a perfect example is in Joshua Teenager versus Superpower. We weren't the only film covering Hong Kong and the Umbrella Revolution and all the turmoil. There was hundreds of films out there. Ours rose to the top because we didn't get ourselves bogged down in a lot of the nuance of Hong Kong politics. Now, the kids in the film have told me, there's a lot that you glossed over, Joe. There's a lot that was important to us that you didn't show. And that was a very conscious choice on my part because I realized I'm making the film for an audience outside of Hong Kong. There's some nuances that that I didn't feel were necessary to the story. To sort of put a finer point on it, in hashtag Chicago Girl, the 19-year-old girl from Chicago, her name is Ala Basatne, and she's just one of my favorite people. And we were taking the film to premiere at ITVA, the big documentary festival in the Netherlands. It's the biggest documentary marketplace, I think, in the world. Had never shown the film before. And we were about to do the screening. The trailer has just dropped, and the trailer went viral in the Middle East. And there were a lot of very, very, very angry people online. This is a female. She should not be doing this. This story is BS. This is propaganda. All the things that come with, when the opposing side realizes there's another narrative out there. And this 19-year-old girl turned to me and said, I think I made a huge mistake. I don't think I should have been in this film. As a filmmaker, my heart broke. I mean, you think, oh my God, we just spent 2 years on this. This is an important topic. How are you? I feel awful that you were feeling like this was a mistake. And so it's our premiere screening, lights go down, movie plays, credits come up, lights come up, and it is dead silent. And again, we've never shown this to an audience other than our little core group in Los Angeles. And suddenly she walks out on stage and the place goes absolutely nuts. I mean, 250 people on their feet. You would have thought the Beatles had just walked out on stage. And she turned to me and she said, I want to take back what I just said. I'm going to now have a larger platform for my message. And suddenly, for her, it clicked. And it was the same with the kids in Hong Kong who felt that I glossed over some nuances. Joshua Wong, when the film came out, was nominated for the Nobel Prize that year because of that film. That suddenly gives him an enormous platform. It makes it a lot harder for him to be disappeared. And so, again, my relationship with my subjects is a little strange because they know I'm making a film about them. They are not clued into the bigger picture of the film until it's pretty much done. And I have a process. I give them the film and I say, I need you to watch it 3 times. I want you to watch it by yourself and you're going to hate it because anytime people see themselves for the first time on screen, they hate the way they talk. They hate the way they look. They hate the way they sound. I said, second, I want you to watch it with your family because your family's going to tell you you look great no matter what. And then third time, I want you to watch it with your best friend. And your best friend they're going to support you, but they're also going to be critical as well in a nice way. And by the time they've seen it 3 times, they forget how their hair looked or how they sounded or that sound bite that they felt we should have used a different one. It all sort of goes away. And they realize, oh, this is going to broaden my message. I can reach a bigger audience for what I'm doing, and I'm okay.
That's amazing. And I love the good takeaway. I'm going to use that from now on. Hunter, do you have similar processes that you've started to find are useful with your subjects?
Yeah, definitely. And it kind of depends on the project, but with the specific project, I was certainly showing them kind of edits as I went along to make sure that they were okay with it, but also to build their trust in me as, someone that's like trying to tell their story the right way, because I was intending to come back to Mexico and film more with them. And I just wanted to make sure that, they saw me as someone that was reflecting them in the right way. One difficult thing about that though is because like a lot of times the edit, a lot changes in the edit, and so like you'll share something and then you end up cutting a chunk of it out, and with a topic like disappearances, and when we're Darwin and Dahlia are very, very close with a lot of families that are searching, and I'm so grateful that they shared their stories with me. But at the end of the day, it had to be a cohesive narrative, and not all of these stories made it into the film. And that's like, it's so hard to make those decisions. It's so hard to know like what to not include when everything has this emotional weight and is important and is the most important thing to that person. And so there is a risk of sharing things with people and then changing them significantly, because you don't want to hurt people. And so it is a kind of a tricky balance.
Yeah, I hear you. One of the nice things with kind of the multi-platform media era we're in now is this idea of other ways that and other forms the media can take, and the kind of editorial relief valve that I know I've found with having kind of digital extras or whatever form it takes, but just knowing that there can be that way to kind of share some of the content. And sometimes the subjects might even be able to utilize some raw media to kind of share as well. I've done that, and I'm sure you two would consider that. And I know, and Nicole mentioned in the chat, just that idea of in editing and, just when and how much can people have that impact. Sometimes I might ask in an interview, what's really important to you as we're finishing the interview? What did you want to say that maybe I didn't ask about? And for me, that is a good indication, the soundbite that follows. Sometimes it's a general overview. Sometimes it's totally something I hadn't expected or gotten to, and that's the soundbite. So I think that idea of the relationship and the kind of engagement, the participatory storytelling is important and powerful. Hunter, I wanted to ask you about, you talked about uplift, and that's literally one of the kind of pillars that you frame your film in terms of a website that has real specific tactics that viewers and community can do. Can you describe that process of how you arrived at that and what those different kind of calls to action are?
Sure. Yeah. If you don't mind, I'll take a step back real quick and just talk about how I got to this. And I mentioned it briefly in my intro with I at the human rights program, when I was a human rights student at the Humphrey School, I plugged into a research initiative called the Observatory on Disappearances and Impunity in Mexico. And that's headed up by Human Rights Program Director Barb Fry, in collaboration with an institute, Flaxo Mexico, in Mexico City, and Oxford University. And our role in Minnesota, our team in Minnesota, we were analyzing the role of the Mexican press that's reporting on disappearances, and analyzing the amount of information, what type of information is available to the public about these cases. So we were Spanish-speaking students that would read lots of articles related to specific cases and put them into a database, code it, say, did this article mention the victim's full name? Did it mention their job? Did it mention where they were last seen? Was there any kind of accountability? Was there, was anyone arrested? And so that was kind of like, our academic research side of it. And we were looking at vast amounts of data, right? And to identify patterns and trends. And one of the things we found was just, Mexico has over 86,000 reported disappearances, and we weren't really finding that many articles. And, what that told us was there isn't a lot of reporting going on. And, there's a lot of reasons for that, the danger involved, the nature of the crime. Disappearances, a lot of the evidence disappears with the crime. But at the same time, we found these outliers, these investigative journalists that were doing exceptional work, individuals and collectives all around Mexico that were reporting on it all the time, and holding the government to account, and demanding they investigate and standing in solidarity with these families. And so looking at, from Minnesota, but looking at these exceptional reporters and being like, wow, like I want to know their story. Like, what makes them tick? Like, what is their approach to journalism? And through our partners in Mexico, I was able to be introduced to the subjects of the film who, I had read a lot of their articles, and it was kind of a, eye-opening experience to then meet them in person, having read all these articles and see actually how they work. And so, yeah, it was just, identifying these reporters as being exceptional, not just journalists, but human rights defenders, and wanting to tell their story and share it with more people.
Yeah, and then you've got this amazing story, and then you've created this platform where in the sharing, there's some very specific, and maybe Nicole, if you could share a link to the website where you really have these calls to action. And I just was wondering if you could just give an overview of what those 3 beats are. Uplift, I think, is one of them. But I just like that idea. And I think we all crave that context and framing for the work that sometimes can be really explicit, like, here's what you can do.
Right. Yeah. So I guess the 4 things I highlighted were to inform an international audience about the crisis of enforced disappearances in Mexico, amplify the reach of these journalists, giving them, people are following them. My friends follow them now. And I think that's really neat. Generate empathy for these victims and their families. And then this is kind of like amplify, but also to just uplift generally these journalists. Joe's been sharing so many amazing stories, so I feel like I have to share a story. But one story that is in the film that relates to this idea of empathy, because I really think the film is about empathy and about caring about an issue even when it doesn't directly affect you. Darwin, the protagonist journalist in the film, is telling a story about the mothers of the disappeared, and oftentimes it's the mothers who are most vocal and most organized when searching for their missing loved ones, and it's remarkable in what they've learned to do without the support of the government. They've learned to be their own forensic scientists, their own lawyers, their own investigators, their own everything, and they also organize these protests. And one of the stories Darwin told was, he didn't name any names, but he said one time a mother, this group of mothers was organizing a protest, and they really wanted a lot of people to show up and join them in the streets. And they organized this protest, and at the end of the day, not a lot of people came, just the same people that always come. And so one time a mother turns to another mother and says, what's going on? Why don't people care? Why are people so insensitive? And then the other mother, who had been searching for her son longer than this mother, turns to her and says, you can't complain, because before your son was disappeared, we were here and you didn't come either. And like that story, just like, even when I say it now, like, gives me goosebumps, because it's just like we're privy to this kind of conversation between two victims of one of the worst human rights violations you can imagine. And even there, this idea of like empathy is prevalent, and what does it take to get people to care about issues before it happens to them, before it directly affects them? And so Darwin and Dahlia, they say, we don't know anybody personally, no friends, no family members, thank God, that have been disappeared, but you see how deeply they care about it, and how they've connected with these families, and how they want to tell their stories. And I just feel like we need more people like that. And that applies to so many issues, right? It's not just this one.
Yeah, wow. Thank you. So empathy is such a great word. It's something literally I put into kind of charters for our projects. And these are just kind of humble local history documentaries, but that the goal is that aspirational, is to engender empathy. And whether that's learning about, the racist restrictive covenants in my film, Jim Crow of the North, and the red lines, or more importantly, green lines that they created, where wealth was developed, and some of us were left out of that. Or, to just really that putting a face on a history and hopefully generating that connection. But I wanted to ask you too about that connection, because both of you exemplify a kind of empathy that crosses culture. and in your collaboration and in your storytelling. But I'm sure that comes also with some kind of tensions and some moments where maybe the cultural kind of difference shows. And I was wondering if you both could talk about that, because again, I think you're really important models in that idea of telling stories from other communities and cultures. And Joe, I know, maybe to start with you, that you said that explicitly, you like go to other places to bring their stories back here to create that empathy. But what's that process like interculturally for you?
Well, I align myself with a team who is there, and a team who is from that place, and a team who I am lucky enough, they bring me into their world. And so, yes, I'm the guy who ultimately makes the decisions, but they're informing every decision I make along the way, because there is an argument to be made of, well, who are you, some guy sitting in Los Angeles, to tell that story? And you're right. Who am I to tell that story? And at the same time, I have the ability, I have the audience, and it's a story that needs to be told, and it's a story that isn't getting told. So how do I partner with the people who I can amplify their voices, I can amplify their work, whether it's a cameraman or a subject, or just being able to immerse myself in their world for enough time to do that story justice. And that's always my goal. I mean, when I shoot in Hong Kong, I don't roll in with my team from Los Angeles. I've got a team in Hong Kong. And to be honest with you, yes, I could bring a team from Los Angeles and the lighting will be perfect and the sound will be amazing. I can pretty much get the same thing in Hong Kong, but I'm going to have people informing me in my decisions on a world that I'm not from. And I need those guides and I need those guardrails to keep me on what's important and keep me. Anyways, I feel very blessed whenever I'm brought into these people's worlds and that they trust me to tell these stories, because it truly is a team effort to tell a story from a place that you're not from.
Yeah, Hunter, you've spoken to it, and just clearly there's a connection, a respect in the work you are doing. But can you talk about the intercultural facet of it?
Yeah, sure. It's such a learning process, and when I started this project, I just I can tell how much more of a grasp I feel like I have on it, and not that I'm an expert by any means now, but just like it, you learn as you go. I entered the project, like basically wanting to make it for an international audience, right? And that in using the academic platform that the university has and all the human rights connections that it has to share this story and amplify it. And that's reflected in the film in kind of the ways that, there's a scene in the film that basically serves to explain the crisis of disappearances in Mexico. And that's context that for a Mexican audience, they probably wouldn't need, like it's used for as a teaching tool, really. But there's a lot of a lot of ideas and things that I need to bounce off people that understand it much more deeply than I do, and I always just have to be ready to make those changes. One thing I want to say though, Daniel, is just that Joe and I have been talking about our more recent projects that are international stories, but I just want to just plug how wonderful your local filmmaking is, and like Jim Crow of the North, and how powerful and important those stories are. And I'd love to hear a little bit about like your hyper local focus and like what got you doing that, and just congratulate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. There's so much to talk about with you two in those films. It's so important, but you're right in that there is a different kind of accountability and a different kind of peace building when you are very much in the community that you're telling stories about. So clearly there's something safe about the past, and that's one way where I think history narratives allow us to kind of approach some of the issues that we're dealing with today. But there has been and will be, I think, tensions around having the whole history of a state like Minnesota. Many of know this kind of the Minnesota paradox, this idea that I think come out of kind of U of M scholarship. Maybe it was Dr. Sam Myers, but this idea of being at once this kind of bastion of progressive politics with abolitionist roots. All of that's very real and then shows up in the Humphreys and Mondales. But at the very same time, literally those abolitionists next to them across the river in St. Paul were slaveholder supporting businessmen. And so they created two different constitutions and kind of battled it out to form the state of Minnesota. So that tension of the two constitutions, one an abolitionist, one not, continues through our history and hasn't always continued in our storytelling. And a lot of that, as we see in America more broadly, has been left out. So that local scholar, international scholar who's local now, Uhuru Williams, talks about historical recovery and really doing the work to surface some of these difficult histories. So when I told the story about the lynching in Duluth in 1920, this kind of nightmare in the North, where 3 African-American young men were lynched by a mob of at least 5,000, that those of us growing up in Minnesota never learned about until recently. And so to surface stories like that isn't always what one expects when you turn on PBS, but it should be, and it often is. And so that's something that's important to me and in my work and with Twin Cities PBS, is to try and tell the whole story. And we know that provides context and is relevant to today. So knowing that history of restrictive covenants that led to worst in the nation disparities, and then seeing how that's showing up in our classrooms, at 38th in Chicago, where George Floyd was murdered, in how policing is patrolling some of these boundaries and borders of opportunity and wealth and red lines and disparity. Knowing that history is crucial to knowing it. But yeah, in a film like Jim Crow of the North, I've had neighbors, white neighbors say, I could see my block in some of the graphics and maps of the red lines and the restrictive covenants. And that really kind of reached me. And so that actually continues. And there's other work happening here in the Twin Cities based on mapping prejudice research and then the film and the awareness. And now you've got different endeavors like the Just Deeds project, where people can, because of a new law, can expunge the racist language from their deed. And then there's a cool art project called Free the Deeds that's building on that to say, in fact, take this lawn sign that said this house had a restrictive covenant, put it in your front lawn, and let's talk with neighbors about this history. So yeah, it's interesting. It can be a different kind of tension, but still works towards the same goals that you two are interested in terms of putting a face on an issue, engendering that kind of empathy, humanizing an issue, and then, I don't mind saying explicitly, hoping for change in the work and kind of calling for that in different ways.
I think that the humanizing aspect to me is always what is so important, because I remember somebody saying to me when I was making #ChicagoGirl, my Syria film, within 10 minutes of the world's worst atrocities happening, it's on YouTube. I mean, it used to be 20 years ago, if you had really sexy footage out of a war zone, you could make a documentary that was just really sexy graphic footage and you'd win all sorts of awards. Well, now I can go on YouTube and see them within minutes of them happening. So how do you put a face on it? How do you put a narrative on it? How do you contextualize it? And how do you make it palatable for an audience to say, wow, I could watch anything tonight. I'm going to spend 90 minutes on this. And, I hate to call it entertainment, because this is the sorts of work you guys and that I do I don't see it as entertainment, but you still need to get people to sit on their couch or to go into a theater or to go to that film festival or to go to that screening and engage with the material. And humanizing it is, in my opinion, how you best do that.
Joe, how does your background as a writer help you do that? You mentioned a little bit some of the kind of narrative film processes earlier, but can you say more about that?
It's about finding. I'm always looking for ways to make people recognizable, to humanizing. I mean, this is a good anecdote. So in my #ChicagoGirl film, one of the characters is a dental student named Aus living in Damascus. And over the course of the film, we watch Aus go from a protest leader organizing on Facebook to ultimately picking up an AK-47 and joining the Free Syrian Army. And it's very hard to get a Western audience to pay attention to people speaking Arabic to people holding automatic weapons. We've seen all that. That's a hard subject to humanize, because you think, well, it's those people over there fighting about something that just really doesn't affect me. So why am I going to pay attention? And in an early scene in the film, we see Aus and Basil, my cameraman. They go to a protest. Aus is a protest leader. There's 1,000 people there. We get these beautiful shots. And on the way back into his apartment building, Aus says, let's order Domino's. I always like to order a pizza after a protest. And it was a throwaway line. You don't even hear him saying it. We caught it on the mic. But that's the moment where people are like, oh, I know what that's like. I know what it's like to come home from something and order a pizza and you're exhausted and you don't feel like cooking. And what are those little moments that you can do in your character intros or in the middle of the film where these people aren't just a superhuman activist, or these people aren't just an extraordinary teenager doing extraordinary things. It's a kid who wants to order a pizza because he's hungry, and that's what you do when you're 24 years old and you come home at midnight. And that's one of my techniques I look for. How do you humanize them in those things that we all recognize?
Yeah, I love that. If you wrote it in one of your scripts, it might feel a little more contrived, but that it's real.
You're probably right, but I don't know. I just remember in editing, my editor being like, we don't even see him. Like, it's just the audio. And I was like, yeah, figure out how to make it work, because that's where we're going to get on the rails of his story in a way that we're not seeing him chanting or seeing him leading 1,000 people or seeing him even get up and make coffee. I mean, the coffee maker in his house is very elaborate. It's very Middle Eastern, and it's something that looks so foreign, but ordering a pizza is not. That's universal.
I love it. Hunter, I'm sure there were moments like that
yeah, I just thought of a few as well. And the protagonist, the journalist Darwin and Dahlia, who are a married couple, if I didn't mention that before, they speak in the film to how their choice of profession affects their personal lives, and they would like to have children, but they've decided, because of their line of work and what they've witnessed, to postpone. And so that's a deeply personal decision on their part, but they do have 5 dogs, a cat, and 2 guinea pigs. And so those tend to be some of the people's favorite scenes, because they have a huge Saint Bernard, and just those types of interactions with their animals at home really people can relate to. And also I'll add that they were necessary for the film. I mean, it's an extremely heavy, terrifying, horrible topic, and to get people to be able to watch a film and that is serving a purpose to inform them, but to get them to watch it the whole way through and not just totally go numb. Like, you have to have those moments of relief and those moments of hope. And because at the end of the day, I mean, why I love these Darwin and Dahlia so much is that they are hopeful. They're pissed off and they're sad, but they're also constantly lifting up these families in their dignity and their determination, and there's a real respect there, and they have fun together, and so it's about being able to have a film that has the right tone, that people can actually humanize, relate to your characters, but also be able to watch the whole thing.
Well, and just I want to add to that, because in watching Hunter and watching your film, it's a very difficult topic. It's told in a language other than English. It's one of those where it's like, okay, you not only have to get people to engage in the topic, you have to get people to read subtitles, which isn't always people's favorite thing to do. And yet what drew me in immediately to that was their relationship with each other. You saw immediately, these are 2 people that have a deep love, admiration, and respect. And immediately that's what hooked me in. And then second, and this is a narrative device, even when I'm writing a narrative feature, I love to introduce characters. When you see somebody doing their job very, very well, I mean, it's why every James Bond film opens up with James Bond doing some kick-ass thing that has nothing to do with the rest of the story. You just want to see him do that thing really well. And that came across very quickly with your characters of, hey, these are 2 people that are very, very good at what they do. And I want to watch more of that. And again, that was the hook that humanized them for me of, all right, I got to turn off my phone because I'm going to watch this thing for the next 38 minutes or whatever your TRT was on it.
Hunter, what did you see in Joe's work that really worked for you, that kind of hooked you to watch?
Yeah, I mean, I watched Joshua Teenager versus Superpower relatively recently, and I mean, the way you were able to tell this story that's like, facing all of Hong Kong, but through the lens of Joshua, it was micro and it was macro. It was deeply personal. Joshua, like, he comes off as just the most genuinely concerned, but like brilliant and not full of himself, but getting all the attention. Like he comes off as such a likable guy, and all his friends are so likable that it just makes you care so much. And then the fact that you had so much footage, and I think when we spoke recently, you mentioned that you came to the project and there was a lot of footage that was shot before, but like you followed him kind of through his youth that he kind of lost, because he is a kid, but he's like the face of a movement, so he's got a lot more responsibility than most kids, but you care about him so much because you watch him grow up. And just the way you were able to tell that story, and how it went from one issue around education to another issue that was even bigger in scale in terms of just the way that he was leading these movements. I don't know. I just thought the editing was superb too, and the music and everything. So,
well, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's all of this speaks to, again, that big question of, when it comes to documentary films, what are the ethics around it? And the way I always describe to my subjects is, if I interview somebody, usually it takes them 5 sentences to say one. The first part of their first sentence is usually great, and then they ramble, and then they get to their point at the second half of the 5th sentence. And what I say to them is, if this was a reality TV, I would chop that up and make you say something you didn't ever say. I'm not reality TV, this is documentary film, but I will clean you up to make you sound smarter. So that's sort of one ethic. But the second one, and this was going to the broader point, is I can't make the definitive film about the Syrian revolution. I can't make the definitive film about Hong Kong's relationship to China. You could poke holes in any definitive film I tried to make all day long, because they are such big topics. They are so complex. They have so many sides to them. But I can take somebody's point of view. I can take what somebody believes. And that's, you can take Joshua Wong, what he believes, it's irrefutable. I mean, he's telling you what he believes. And so I find it, again, I look at this as, hey, I'm not telling the story about Hong Kong's relationship to China. I'm telling the story about a 13-year-old boy who lit the fuse on turmoil. I'm not telling the story of the Syrian revolution. I'm telling the story of a 19-year-old girl in Chicago who's helping run that revolution. And when you put it through that lens, it becomes a lot easier to tell that story, because otherwise I get so bogged down in all the points of view you need to have and all the various angles you need to cover, and you realize I'm still not doing it justice. It's still too big of a topic. So, how do you to tell the macro, you got to go micro, and that to me is kind of the words my team and I live by in terms of how do you put a face on a broad topic.
So this has been a great through line, because that comes back to the idea of personification and hero chasing, as Joe says, with his moniker. And there's a great question that brings us back to something you two have both touched on from Sabina, and it comes back to this issue of trust. And it's something I think about a lot, in my work with PBS. We kind of throw around that term because it's something that people say, and we're one of the most trusted, American institutions. But how do we keep re-earning that in our work in and with community? And so, and I would love for other folks to share questions as well, as we have about 15 minutes left. I'm sure you have a lot, but let's start there, you two. Could you say more about that idea of trust building and trust in the sharing of people's stories, and how you keep that word in mind in the work you do?
Are you talking trust between me and the audience, or are you talking trust between me and my subject?
I think the question is, yeah, it's a good point. Maybe a little bit more about the subject, but I'm interested in that idea of audience as well.
Well, with my subjects, it's interesting, but my first two films were about young kids. And I remember saying to this 19-year-old girl in Chicago, is it weird that there's a film crew following you around to school and to your home and to your friends' houses? And she looked at me kind of funny. She was like, no. And I remember thinking, oh, you're of the generation of everybody has a reality show. Everybody's got their own YouTube channel. Having a film crew follow them around, isn't that novel? In fact, they all in some way think that's the way it should be. They have something to say, and why isn't somebody getting what this I have to say on camera? On this film I did in Vietnam, she wasn't a teenager anymore. When we started filming her, she was in her late 20s. And it was a different relationship. She was immediately distrustful of me. I had to work much harder to build that trust. I'm not sure I totally did. I think in some ways I did. She trusted me enough to tell her story, but I think it was a lot harder to build trust with a 27-year-old or a 28-year-old than it was with an 18-year-old. And it was a lesson for me, because I just sort of assumed, oh, everything I'd done from these previous two films will just carry over to here. And as long as I do my thing competently, they'll trust that I'm going to do right by them, because I am going to do right by them. And it was a lot harder to build that rapport. There was a lot more, it took a lot more to get honesty out of that subject. And not because she was manipulative or had a different agenda. It was just, I think, always everything was through the filter of, well, what does this guy really want from me as a filmmaker, as opposed to 15-year-old, 16, 17-year-old kids are just like, well, I can be myself because I'm always myself, and I'm myself on my YouTube channel and my Instagram and my Facebook, and so I'm going to be myself with the camera crew who's following me around. That doesn't seem that weird to me.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, in the vein of media literacy, I would like for all of our communities to have a level of circumspection, at least, about media and sharing their story and how best to share it and share it safely. Hunter, I was wondering specifically if your work kind of emerging out of human rights scholarship has given you some tools in this space of trust. Are there some specific things, because of your unique kind of academic and artist synergy, that you can tap into?
No, that's a really great question, because I mean, that was, largely a lot of the reason I wanted to go back to school was to have that academic foundation. And I took a really awesome course in human rights fact finding when I was at the University of Minnesota with Janet Walsh, who worked with Human Rights Watch for a long time. And that was super interesting, because it was all about, informed consent, and all about like setting up interviews with people and going about it in a way that doesn't, re-traumatize, and also just in a safe way if you're entering situations where you could put people at risk for even talking to you. And it was interesting because there were a lot of things that I learned from that I'm applying, but there were other things that were like, oh, like, that's a little bit different than how you'd interview someone in documentary filmmaking, because like you do need people to say things like cleanly and clearly sometimes, and you do need, like, you might ask them to say something again so you can get it the right way. Whereas with human rights fact finding, that's not necessarily what you do, but by and large, it was an extremely helpful course to take, because I think so many of those same those ethical practices can be applied to documentary filmmaking, and have helped me in the ways that I talk to people that have experienced, horrible violations.
Yeah, I share that sense in the world of history, and there's a formal oral history process that scholars do. I ain't one of them. And so, like Joe, I am pretty clear that what I'm looking to do is tell stories, and so it means a different kind of methodology in the interview, and it's more conversational, and I'm looking for anecdotes. And often I'm pretty explicit about that. Tell me that again in the form of a story, not just what's your address, but what was your house like, So keeping an eye on questions, but I got plenty still for you two while we have just a few minutes left. And this is a little bit of an interlude, but I was wondering, even if quickly, starting with you, Joe, you could talk about, I've mentioned Gordon Parks several times. Who is an influence on you as a storyteller, especially that idea of stories that make change?
God, that's a great question. I don't have that one, oh, this is who I'm modeling this after. I came into documentary film in such a roundabout way that part of it was I was just kind of doing my own thing in this medium I didn't totally know, but I was smart enough to surround myself with the right people who knew how to get what I was asking for. I love stories that entertain and inform. And whether it's a narrative feature or a documentary, I love something where I forget that I'm watching a film. I forget where I'm at. It's just, what are those things that pull me into that story, that I don't check my phone, I don't answer the doorbell, I don't answer the knock on my office door behind me. I just got to see what's happening next. And again, I feel the great need. I mean, I feel like it's my calling to, hey, how do we tell these important stories that need to get out? But I also have worked in the business of Hollywood long enough to know you got to have a beginning, middle, and end of this story to get people to do that. So I don't have that one icon. I really have more of a set of rules that I try to follow of keep the audience engaged, be respectful of who your subjects are. And, sort of going back to your previous question, how do you build trust? I build trust with an audience in that I don't manipulate. I mean, we use a lot of headlines and news clips to further the story. And a lot of times that perfect headline or that perfect soundbite from, CNN happened well after the fact. I don't use those. We go in and we find what's the news clip that happened in the moment. What's the one that covered it the day after, not the one 12 months after the fact gave you that perfect soundbite, because I want people to be in the moment with my film. I want people to be in that part of the timeline, not manipulate by using something that it's true, but it didn't really happen as I'm claiming it's happened. And I think that helps build that trust of, okay, what he's telling me isn't manipulated. What he's telling me isn't run through a filter to get me to feel a certain way. I mean, it's a little bit like when you see a film that relies on score to get emotion out. Well, we all know when we're being manipulated. You know that if you turn the score off, you don't feel the same way. How do you do the same thing in documentary film, where getting people to feel that without having to use the crutch of something out of context or a piece of score to get them to feel that way? And that's a challenge, but at the same time, it's what gets me excited to make these. I want you to feel something. I want you to walk out of that saying, oh my God, I didn't know that was happening. And now I've got to pay attention to it because I was so moved.
Yeah, I hear you. And you make me think of, the popular genre of true crime and how much those narratives rely on the unreliable narrator.
Yes.
We're 3 episodes in and you're just now sharing this. I mean, it was dope the way you surprised me, but
it makes you step back and think, well, where else did they dupe me? Where else was I just on their ride, not the ride? And that to me is the difference between documentary filmmaking and reality TV, or a true crime, which is, they're fun to watch, but they can be manipulative to make you feel a certain way when that maybe isn't really how it unfolded. It just was convenient and unfolded that way because it gave you a nice 3-act structure for episode 3.
What about you, Hunter? What's inspired you early on in your career or today?
Yeah, I'll just share a little story. I had a really incredible opportunity a couple summers ago. There was a documentary that came out called For Sama, which was, maybe you've heard of it. It was about a woman and her daughter and her husband living in one of the last operating hospitals in Aleppo. And she filmed over the course of, I don't know, maybe 8 years or something. And she's the filmmaker, and just incredibly intimate footage, brutal, horrific footage, but exactly what we're talking about, putting a face to this issue, and one you care about deeply, and her daughter, and seeing her daughter grow up. But the opportunity I had, actually, I was in New York for a summer, doing some work with Human Rights Watch, and I was invited to participate on this impact panel, basically, to try to help develop an impact campaign for that film. And I got invited kind of last minute, and I was like, sure, I'll come. And then I I watched a screener of the film the night before and I was blown away and I felt like I knew this family so well. The next day I go to this impact campaign meeting, and it was 9 of us, including the 2 stars of the film that lived through this. It's not like they're like celebrities. It was like I felt like I knew their life deeply and had seen their friends die. It was like crazy to sit in the same room as them and then talk about, okay, what are we going to do with this story to make change, and like, what is the ask and how are we going to do it? And just to see, I mean, they were incredibly humble, just wonderful people, but just to see them share this story after like feeling like I was with them for 8 years and then meeting them and just having them talk about what they wanted, how they wanted to use this film for change. It was just like so inspiring. And I was just so like honored to be part of that conversation. But yeah, that film's incredible. If anyone has a chance to see it, I think it was nominated for an Oscar a couple years ago.
It's a great film, and it's one. I mean, again, the films that I love it when I'm inspired, and I love it when I'm inspired. I often am inspired by my own subjects, where you get to, and it may be something. I mean, to give you a brief anecdote, there was this kid in my film I talked about. His name was Alice. He was the dental student, and we were in editing on the film, and I had never met him. I mean, I just interacted with him online, and my camera crew in Syria captured his story. And one day I said to him, Alice, I've now watched 100 hours of footage of you. I actually know you pretty well. All you know about me is I'm some filmmaker in Los Angeles. Like, when you go to my Facebook page, what do you see? And he quickly wrote back, we were on a instant message, and he said, you seem to be a man who's perpetually on vacation. And that probably sums up my Facebook feed. I live near the beach in Los Angeles. I have children, and that's what I use Facebook for. But then he said something that has really driven what I do. He said, what I don't have a sense of is, what do you believe in? What would you stand up for? If this was happening in your neighborhood and you are married and you have children and you have a mortgage and you have a good job, would you have the courage to stand up? I mean, that'll cause a midlife crisis in a guy my age to ponder something like that too hard. I'd like to think I would stand up. I don't know if I would, but hearing somebody say that to me, man, that's a powerful, wind in my sails every time we take on these big stories. Am I standing up and doing the right thing? Am I telling the right story? Am I doing the right thing for these people to tell what needs to be told?
And super quick, Joe, start with you and then to you, Hunter. There was a question about this past year, 2020, the pandemic, George Floyd, maybe throwing up an intense political year. What are you working on now, quickly, and how is this past year and what we experienced informing your work?
Well, I'm in the middle of making another film in another foreign country. I can't say which yet, but it's what George Floyd and all of the turmoil of the pandemic has shown me is we've got a lot of issues to tackle here in our own country. And in some ways, it's made what I do harder. It's harder to get people to pay attention to what's going on in a foreign country when our news is filled with all that's going on here. And that's not a criticism of it. In fact, it tells me, man, we got a lot of work to do everywhere. But I've just noticed, even on this new film that I'm shooting, it used to be I could just pitch a human rights story in another country with a great subject, and immediately people wanted to know more. And now it's, oh, that's great, but did you just see the news last night here? Did you just see the clip of the latest horrible thing that just happened? And it's made it, we're just in this weird window where we're very consumed with what's going on domestically, as we should be. There's a lot of issues to tackle.
Yeah, quickly, Hunter, can you share what you're working on and kind of how last year affected you, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, no, totally. I fully agree with Joe, and I'm currently working on another short piece related to the issue of disappearances in Mexico, because I shot it last year. And but like Joe said, I mean, it's made me want to focus much more here locally, and again, praising the work of Daniel and just like telling those really important stories. I was thrilled to have this film selected in the Minneapolis St. Paul International Film Festival. and it was screened in a block of films, short films, and the theme was seeking justice. And two of the other films were around George Floyd and from local filmmakers. And I mean, it was so cool to see those stories, and they were both very different. One was more kind of a run and gun documentary in the aftermath immediately, and then one was kind of an experimental film that made a really deep point. And so I just think those stories are so important to tell. And I'm also a photographer, and so I've been doing some photo series here locally, trying to tell some stories of specifically with Somali American youth, and that's been really, really cool to do. So looking forward to do more things like that.
Awesome. We're looking forward to seeing it. Thank you to both, and Gordon Parks would be proud. Thanks everybody for being a part of this. Hey, Nicole, do you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Having Hunter and Joe and Daniel here has been just incredible. You all are inspirational as filmmakers. You know, some of the things that we've been thinking about is how does art facilitate a different way of peace building than other mediums don't, you know? So I'm curious, and I'm thankful that we got to talk a little bit about this, and I'm looking forward to the crowd that's with us today seeing your films. And one of my big things, we had a discussion previously, you know, what can we do for you as filmmakers? And I think the biggest thing is support film. Support documentary film, support independent film, and tell those stories that need to be told and that are not told about the communities that are so important in our world. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I think we might even be showing the trailers after we close out with you all. So thanks again. And just, you know, a little technicalities. We're taking about 15 minutes and we have our next session coming up. We're very excited for Dr. Joy Lewis and Dr. Brittany Lewis. And we are, just make sure that you mute yourself and you turn off your camera, and we'll see you in a few minutes. I think we're going to put up some videos, so stick around as well. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Hunter. And thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Support TPT.
En México nadie desaparece. En México las personas las desaparecen. Gran parte del periodismo que hago tiene que ser para encontrar una explicación de lo que está pasando.
Yo creo que tenemos que visibilizar la lucha que están haciendo las familias. Una lucha por encontrar la justicia, por encontrar la verdad, por encontrar a sus seres queridos desaparecidos.
Está realizando el descubrimiento de este cuerpo justo 3 años después de que fue desaparecido. Todas las historias, particularmente a uno, le duelen y le duelen mucho. Yo tengo la fortuna que tengo a Dalia, ¿no?
Tenernos para escucharnos y para cuidarnos.
¿Dónde están los desaparecidos?
Nosotros tenemos que ser capaces de dar cuenta del horror de la guerra, pero también tenemos que ser capaces de dar cuenta de cómo la esperanza y el amor crece aún en el escenario más oscuro. Aún en la pesadilla más terrible sucede la esperanza. Y entonces como periodistas tenemos que ser también capaces de vislumbrar eso.
各位市民大家好，召集人黃之鋒，而家就呼籲希望大家而家同我哋一齊。
In 1997, Hong Kong was handed back to the Chinese by the British. Here you have a Western-bred population being handed back to the communists.
Seems like a real David and Goliath kind of struggle.
Joshua is very passionate and he truly cares about Hong Kong and is willing to give everything for it.
What we hope to do is just demand freedom of mind and freedom of speech.
It's not Hong Kong anymore.
The future of Hong Kong should be decided by Hong Kongers.
He encouraged normal, ordinary Hong Kong people to care about Hong Kong.
It's the Joan of Arc story, right? The youngster who can see the world clearly and comes into a complicated adult conflict.
The sense of scale could not be larger.
I didn't realize it would be so hard.
Hong Kong is the place that I born, I live, and the place that I love.
There's a moment that you thought, wow, we are gonna make history.
Joshua Wong did not do it as a particular political campaign. There was a sense of innocence that made people identify with it.
We have the responsibility to protect our hometown.
I will never stop until Hong Kong is Hong Kong again.